Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient. Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Resilient with Jen Chambers. I'm very excited today that I get to talk to my friend Stacy Kean about her new book, The Nazi Housewife of Queens, New York. It's an incredible story, so fascinating, and her personal story is great as well. We didn't really get to the story about her experiences with chronic illness until next time, but that's good because there'll be a next time. So please tune in and please go follow Stacy Kean at her website, Stacy Kean Writes, or at her Instagram account, which is skeen writes, Skean writes, Writes. Thank you. And just as a warning, I tried to clean it up the best I could, but the very beginning of this audio is a little bit muddy, and that's completely operator error. So I apologize. The rest of it's better, but there's just a little part at the beginning. Again, thanks for listening. I'm so glad you're here.
Hey,
How are you?
good. How are you?
Fantastic.
Awesome.
I was just so excited to see you. I just can't wait to hear about all of your book stuff. I wanted to talk to you about everything in your life, but first of all, tell me about your new book.
Yeah, my new book came out about 2.5 weeks ago, and it's been a wild ride to have it out in the world. I got the idea for the book a decade ago, so it's been a journey and fun to see the book evolve. I love research, so I went down a lot of rabbit holes and discovered a lot of interesting things. I think the book is an interesting take on historical fiction. World War II novels are pretty popular, pretty common. I think my book is a little bit of a different twist because we have the point of view of a Nazi concentration camp guard and a survivor story kind of intermingled. So I think that's a little bit of a different point of view on it. I think readers will really enjoy that kind of different take and kind of some insights into why people may have done these horrible things.
How did you first start becoming a writer? This is your first book, but it's definitely not the first thing you've written.
Yeah, I would say in my book, I have a dedication page where I dedicate the book to my husband and my daughter, but also my grandma Jean, who taught me how to read. She was really interested in writing too. She and I used to make up children's stories together. We would do little books like about Salty the cat, which was our cat. And I was probably 4, 5, 6 years old when I was doing that. And then I got strep throat, like a really bad case of strep throat when I was 9. Like I was in the hospital for a few days. My grandma Jean gave me this bigger book, and I was like, oh, that's a grown up book. And it was the biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. And she's like, you can read it, you can do it. And I did, and I really enjoyed it. That sparked like my interest in history. And so I give my grandma Jean a lot of credit for being interested in writing and storytelling.
Mhm.
And then I think the other thing when I was really young was in 5th grade, we had to write pioneer diaries because we did, I'm an Oregon kid, so you always do the Oregon Trail
Right.
history
Yes.
segment in elementary school.
Uh-huh.
And they gave prizes for that. And I got first prize for my pioneer diary. And that kind of sparked in me like, oh, like I can tell stories. And then in high school, I was associate editor of my school paper and wrote for my school paper. And in college, I wrote for the Student Association magazine and got to write about different issues around campus. And I got to interview the university president and all that sort of stuff. So if you go way back, that's kind of the basis of how I got interested in writing and storytelling.
I love that because you have a basis in fiction. That's like a spark for imagination. It sounds like from what your grandmother did. And I would love for you to write those books about your cat.
Yeah, Salty was a legendary cat.
That's wonderful. And then it sounds like it really fed your thirst for creating things and for falling into that rabbit hole both with your college and high school, you could do the nonfiction side.
Yeah, I've always been like a mad researcher, like from a very young age.
It's my favorite. Museums are the best. It's so much fun.
Yeah, it is. I'm just like obsessed.
You gave us a small synopsis of your book. Now your book's available everywhere, right? And
Yes,
give us the
everywhere.
title.
Yeah, I actually brought a little hard copy because I finally
Nice.
got the. Oh, here it is. Nazi Housewife of Queens, New York. And it is based on a true story about a concentration camp guard who married an American serviceman and ended up being, they called her in the media all the time, Queen's housewife. And that's why I thought it was interesting to put that in the book. And also, I love the idea of exploring, because in the 50s, early 60s, there was a really defined role for women, like this very June Cleaver, vacuuming in your pearls. Both the camp guard and the survivor are in America in this time, and they're immigrants. So they're like, how do I adapt to this new reality? And then, of course, back then there wasn't PTSD and mental health wasn't as well known and trauma and those types of things. So it was really interesting in the book to explore that, particularly for the survivor character, of how you just cope with trauma without, people just say, forget it, move on. You don't need to talk about it anymore. Like, that's an ugly past. Why would we go there? And that another thing from my grandparents, my grandpa was a World War II veteran and he never talked about it. He never said anything. He would say a few things when he took a ship from England to North Africa. They fed them like rancid mutton, and that's why I couldn't eat lamb. Like little
Whoa.
things like that.
Whoa,
But he
that's
wouldn't tell, like, I know he saw some things, right? But he never talked about it.
mm. Now you said that a piece of research led you to thinking about this topic. I know it's based on a real thing.
Yeah, so 10 years ago, I was watching some documentary about the Nazis and Hitler, and they had footage, and they had this like section of women like looking crazed. Like, when you see this video of like Elvis and the Beatles, like the women are screaming and their eyes look crazy
Mhm.
and these women are doing this over Hitler. And I'm like, retrospectively, obviously, I know what happened. And you go, why? But I was really curious because you don't hear about women as much in the Third Reich. I was like, what is the deal?
Mhm.
Why were they so crazed about him?
Mhm.
I was just curious. Like, I wanted to learn more. And we did a trip to San Francisco, and I think I was in an airport, where you have all the books.
Right.
And there was a book called Hitler's Furies, and it's a nonfiction book about women in the Third Reich. And I was like, oh, that's some light reading for the plane.
Fun. Gotcha.
And so when I read that, and that was all about the types of women who were serving in these roles of camp guard and these paramilitary roles. And these women were zealots and true believers. And then she was mentioned, the real camp guard was mentioned in that book. And that's what set me off because it was like, wait, what? She was in the United States?
Wow. I just, it's hard to imagine. You know that they all lived in plain sight in South America and things like that. But it's incredible. That was a real story. And
Yeah.
wow. The research must have been interesting and yet horrible at the same time.
Yeah. So there was a lot of really interesting research about her coming here and how the United States responded and why there wasn't much interest in the part of the US government to get her out. I mean, she was discovered in 1964, wasn't extradited till 1973. So almost a decade.
Wow.
Uh, yeah. And there were some real reasons for that. The other piece of it that was super hard research was the trials and hearing the witness testimony. The reason the survivor community pursued this was okay, like obviously concentration camp is horrible beyond imagination.
Right, right.
And she stood out in this horror as being beyond, like the worst of the worst.
Oh,
And just that research was really hard. I put the things I put in the book are based on witness testimony. I found a couple-hour documentary of the Dusseldorf trial after she was extradited. And that documentary focused on the witnesses and Those are things they said happened, and they are shocking. They are unbelievable. And in the Dusseldorf trial, there were it was called the Meidenek trial because they were trying people who had been part of the Meidenek camp.
Mhm.
And there were about 13 or 15 defendants. She was the only one who got a life sentence. And I believe a lot of that was because of the stories these women told, because they were just beyond. And she was really in charge of separating children from their mothers to send the children to gas chambers. And I think that's the other piece is it's just such a hard topic,
Right.
but for people to remember that this genocide was complete. Old people, women, children, and beyond that, Polish people who weren't Jewish, people who had disabilities, and this systematic horror of the whole thing. It's 80 years ago now, so people maybe don't know, or these are hard topics. Like, no one wants to think about that.
But it's so important and so needed. As you say, people aren't forgetting it, and there is definitely a rise of anti-Semitism that's becoming very popularized. So
Yeah,
it's more and more important to realize that for lots and lots of reasons, those sorts of things were overlooked and
yeah.
how insidious it is.
Yeah. And in the book, and this is also true,
Mhm.
during the Dusseldorf trial, which took place between 1976 and 1981, there was a group called Silent Help, who was former Nazis who had kind of two roles. They were kind of a propaganda arm of Holocaust denial. And then the other role that they had was supporting former Nazis. So Silent Help was at the Dusseldorf trial handing out flyers about what they call the Auschwitz lie and discrediting the Anne Frank diaries. And
Oh,
so they were there, and then they were giving like coffee and donuts to the supporters of the Guard. And so they were kind of a support unit, and
oh,
they operated from the late 40s. They were part of what was called the rat line to get Nazis to South America
oh,
through getting them fake baptismal certificates, getting
mhm,
them refugee status. And so they operated from the late 40s through the 1990s.
oh,
And they helped notorious Nazis like Klaus Barbie. And the leader of the group, and who was the public face, was Heinrich Himmler's daughter, Gudrun. And she's in the book. Part of the camp guard character was hard to write because it's just like, how do you get in that mindset? And there were two things that really helped me. One is that villains don't think they're villains. They just don't. They don't look at themselves as villains. They rationalize and deny, and then they turn it like, actually, I'm the victim. And that was really her point of view. Like, I was just this lowly camp guard. I was just doing my job. I was following orders, the classic
mhm,
thing that people would say.
mhm,
So that was one piece of it. And the other piece of it was just discovering Silent Help and
mhm,
Gudrun Himmler.
mhm.
And that was just fascinating to me that this group existed and wildly had nonprofit status in West Germany,
Oh,
which was
what?
wild to me. Yeah. So that piece kind of brought an interesting dynamic to the trial in Dusseldorf. And
Mhm,
so Gudrun Himmler is in my book. And I don't know that she had contact with the real person, but I know her group was present at that
mhm,
trial.
mhm,
And the really great thing about historical fiction is you can be like, okay, I'll just bring Gudrun Himmler into this picture because it's fascinating to me that
mhm.
this group existed.
Right.
Gudrun Himmler, she died in 2018,
Mhm.
and that was her life's work, was trying to redeem her father's reputation in some way. And then
Wow.
also this group, like they did propaganda, they provided legal support.
Mhm.
Um, they apparently were behind, and this is maybe another book, they apparently were behind a retirement community that housed former Nazis. Like they ran a retirement community.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Now, how did you research the other side, the housewife whom you talked about? What was the process there?
So the survivor side, the character Hannah is a
Uh-huh,
composite of several different women. And I just had so much respect for these women who testified in New York to get her extradited, and then
uh-huh,
women who testified in Germany. And there were some American women, and then there were some women from Israel and Poland and Canada. But the women in the United States, the crazy thing was, is there were a lot of survivors in Queens. So these women who had actually suffered under her were living near her, like she was in their community. And so there were a couple different women that I pulled together to kind of create that character. And
mhm,
then she was really interesting to write because it was like she was more fictionalized. She wasn't as set as the camp guard. And so just using elements from different stories. And then there was a book called New Lives that was about survivors, men and women, and how they established new lives in America. And that was huge because a lot of the book, it's like a World War II book, but probably
mhm.
only 20% of it takes place during the war. The rest of it is post-war. And so it was really interesting to write her of coming to America, getting this new start, having a family, trying to adapt to being an American, and then dealing with trauma when there's no resources for trauma. And being successful and then being brave and like facing down this person who you saw kill people, torture people, facing down this person sometimes twice, once in the United States and once in Germany. And so these women to me were really incredible.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. It's heartening and it's hopeful to find that little kernel of beauty and fighting back amidst all of that horror. It must have been really the counterpart to learning about all of the awfulness.
Yeah, it was. And it wasn't easy.
Right.
And being that witness for the other people who died.
Mm,
And these women, the reason she was found by Simon Wiesenthal, who was really famous Nazi hunter,
mhm,
and he had just been part of discovering Eichmann in the early 60s. So he had notoriety.
mhm.
And so there were women in an airport in Tel Aviv, and they heard Simon Wiesenthal's name called over the PA system for a phone call. And these two women were survivors of Maidanek and had suffered under this camp guard. And they went and found him, and they said, "We were at Maidanek, and there was this woman who was just beyond horrible. We don't know what happened to her." And he said, "Okay, I'll look into it." And he discovered her, that she had married an American, that she was living in the United States. And he tipped off a New York Times reporter who found her in
Woo,
1964. And it was a story in the New York Times in
wow,
July of 1964,
wow, that's a
where they said
real
Queen's
story.
housewife alleged to be notorious camp guard.
I love the fact that you're giving another life to these survivor stories and making it important and relevant because it's very relevant today. More than that, bringing them up and right, making their story louder. I think that's just so incredible. It's a wonderful book, and I hope that lots and lots of people read it because I think it's so fascinating. So tell us about what you're working on next. Do you have another historical project or something based on this? Or are you taking a break right now where you're publicizing?
I am in the research phase of a next book. Holocaust research is kind of mentally and emotionally taxing.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
a bit.
have been fascinated with the United States Gilded Age, like
Mhm,
the post Civil War to World War One,
mhm.
where there's tremendous growth and fabulous wealth concentrated, and a lot of really fascinating characters. Just reading about the Gilded Age, I discovered a woman who was President Grant's granddaughter named Julia, after her grandmother.
Mhm.
Her aunt Bertha was very wealthy. She was part of this Gilded Age wealthy social class. She's kind of like a Forrest Gump of the late 19th, early 20th century. Like she meets everybody
Wow.
of significance
Uh-huh.
because of who her grandfather is. Her
Right.
grandfather was President Grant. And
Uh-huh.
she was born at the White House in 1867 or 1876. She was born in the White House, which is like, wow.
Yeah.
And then she lived to be 99. So she saw this whole expanse of US history that is super fascinating. But her Aunt Bertha was the women's director of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. So she took her niece around Europe to promote the World's Fair when she was a teen. She spent a lot of time with her aunt in Europe later because she was wealthy. Her aunt was wealthy. The Grants were not at all wealthy. They were terrible with money. So Julia didn't have money, but her aunt did. And so she was part of all these social circles. Her father, Frederick Grant, was appointed ambassador to Austria. So she met Empress Sisi and was part of these royal circles in Austria. And then after that, she was spending time in Europe with her aunt, and her uncle was sick, and they were in the Mediterranean. She met a Russian prince, Prince Michael Cantacuzene. At that time, a lot of nobility in Europe were marrying American heiresses because they were running out of money. And so she always had to tell people, like, I don't have money.
Just right up front.
Just up front. They thought she had money because she was the president's granddaughter, right?
Right.
And she was traveling with this fabulously wealthy aunt. And so she would tell people, like, yeah, I don't have money. And so this prince that she met in this resort, she said to him, hi, yeah, I know you're like chatting me up. I don't have money. And he's like, that's fine, because he had a lot of it.
Wow.
So he pursued her
Uh-huh.
and they got married in Europe. And then they had another marriage ceremony in the United States. You know, her wealthy aunt footed the bill.
Mhm.
And then she moved to Russia with her husband, who had a huge estate in what is now Ukraine. And she talks about riding in a carriage from the train station, and all the villagers are giving her loaves of bread and salt because that was a tradition. And then there's this huge house and her mother-in-law, and it's like this crazy
Wow.
Russian nobility of massive estates and this world that no longer is there. You know, a
Right.
peasant husband was a military officer, and they would go to St. Petersburg because he was also a prince, he was nobility. And so she got to know the emperor, the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, and she was especially close to the Tsar's mother, the Dowager Empress Maria. She had some really great observations about Rasputin and the court, and she also had this really great Ohio Midwestern American sensibility, right?
Oh,
So
wow.
it's so fun to see her in this world. And she's like, during the First World War, she's rolling bandages with the Dowager Empress in St. Petersburg. This is so wild.
Whoa.
And then when the revolution comes, she's the one who's like, look, this is not going to go well. Your world is ending. And her husband's like, I have to fight for the czar. And they have a couple kids. And so she decides in 1917 that she needs to leave. She understands her husband's going to continue the fight in what is now a Russian civil war. She sneaks out of Russia with diamonds and jewels sewn into her dress so she could escape with some of the wealth that they had and with her children. She comes back to the United States and she becomes this activist ringing the bell about Bolshevism and the dangers and what she saw. She was a great writer, writing columns and talking about what's happening in Russia, raising money and all this stuff. So eventually her husband admits defeat and gets out of Russia. Yeah. And her aunt is building a community in Sarasota, Florida. And she said, okay, you guys should come to Sarasota. I started this bank. And so Prince Michael works at the bank.
No way.
Sadly, he falls in love with a teller and leaves Julia, which is a bummer. She just goes on to be this person who is actively involved in Republican politics, and she has a point of view, and she has this really great kind of Midwestern, really American sensibility about her because she did grow up with her grandpa, and her family wasn't wealthy. They were very practical people. And so to see her in these kind of glittering circles and amid all this change of kind of being this practical voice, she got to know all the presidents. Like she would visit the White House, you know, like 1966 when she's 90. Lady Bird Johnson invites her back to the White House with all the surviving children that had grown up in some way in the White House. And so she goes back there in 1966. And it's just those things are amazing to me and like this span of history. And she witnessed so much of it. And she was this kind of practical woman who, by dint of the fabulous wealth of her aunt and then the fabulous wealth of her husband, are in these circles.
It sounds like both of your books, that both the one you're working on and the one that you've already written, have quite a theme of strong women standing up for the things that they believe in. Is there any other theme or a message you feel like comes through in your work?
I do think women's voices aren't heard in history. For me, just kind of going back to elementary, middle school, I was fascinated by history, even at that young age. And I would see it was just the stories of presidents and great men and generals. And occasionally you would get the thing to me, it was always in a little box or sidebar of like
Mm-hmm.
Susan B. Anthony. You get maybe a paragraph.
Right.
And it's like, well, we know women have always existed and they're participating in all of this. So where are their stories? Where
Mm-hmm.
are their voices?
Mm-hmm.
And with all the limitations they had, how did they? And there were women who were speaking out, who were like participating, who, like Julia, were just saying, hey, Russia, the system you have is not going to last. Like, you should be paying attention to this.
Mm-hmm.
Or one of the ladies in waiting to the Tsarina was the one who facilitated the Rasputin thing. And Julia was like, yeah, it's this lady in waiting is bringing in some bad elements. So I think these women are participating, but also seeing things and being very prescient and very observant and saying, hey, world.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. And I really think that's important as well. Giving voice to the not voiceless, but maybe not the listened to for sure.
When the Nazi housewife, that whole story broke about the extradition in the early 70s,
Mm-hmm.
there was quite a bit of press coverage, as you could
Uh-huh.
imagine. Like it was a pretty big story, but I don't think anybody knows about it now, you know?
Right, right, which is why it's so important to hear.
Yeah. And I don't
And
think many people know about Julia Grant or President Grant's granddaughter. Not a ton of people know about her.
no, and actually, what a wonderful subject to research on the heels of the other, just because you're right, there's a lot more light and maybe a little glitz and glamour that kind of is helpful in balancing it out.
And
Yes.
again, there's also these crazy wild details, like her aunt, Bertha, who's a huge figure in Chicago. She helped invent the brownie. She told them at the women's pavilion, I want something that's not a cookie, but not a cake to serve here. And they invented the brownie in 1893, which is one of my favorite treats. So I'm like, she needs to have credit.
I think that's absolutely necessary.
Aunt Bertha, give her the props she deserves.
That's amazing.
And then her story could be a book too. I mean, she was just this phenomenal person who was a leader in Chicago, who was really crucial in setting up a community in Sarasota, Florida. And she married a much older man. So she had a widowhood, which actually oddly gave women freedom because they had resources and they could use it as they saw fit.
Hmm. Hmm. With the kind of freedom that they had heretofore not had pretty much ever.
Yeah. So I think that's fascinating too. I don't think people realize that back in the late 19th century, women couldn't do very many things, and their money wasn't their own. If they were
Right,
married, it belonged to their husband.
right, right.
I think a lot of times too, I think in this current world, I sometimes wonder if people realize that women fought for these rights to have autonomy and make their own money, and that is all fairly recent.
It is interesting, isn't it? Over the course of human civilization, women had been fighting, but it didn't get any traction until the last 40, 50 years, really.
Yeah. And then when you look at other parts of the world, when you look at Saudi Arabia and like male guardianship. Like if you're a Saudi Arabian woman, you can't do a lot of things without your husband, father, brother, whoever's the male head of your house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In a lot of these conservative theocratic countries, that's the reality to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's,
Uh,
I think there's a little bit of an amnesia among Western American, Western European women. Like, hey, like all this stuff is pretty new and
mhm.
it can roll back.
Now, we're going to have to make a part two for you because I want to hear all about your journey with chronic illness, but I want to make sure that everybody can find you. So, what are your socials? What are the places where people can find both you and your book?
Go to stacykeanwrites.com, STACYKEAN writes.com. And that's my website, and my socials are linked in there. And it links to the book, obviously.
Good, good, good.
Buy the book.
Excellent. And where in the world are you located so that the listeners know? I kind of jumped into talking about your book because I was so excited.
I'm in Portland and grew up here. And my house now is actually quite close to my grandparents' house where I spent a lot of my young years, my grandma who taught me to read.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a full circle. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. And I can't wait
Yeah.
to get back to your story next week.
Oh, yeah, that'd be awesome. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Sometimes we have to start over. Sometimes we have to fight back. Sometimes it's all too much. Lost inside the black. Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient. Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient. Sometimes we need to lift the voices of those who've overcome and expose the ones that made the choices